Today, we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. These stories claimed lives in very different ways. The first cave had been permanently sealed by authorities who knew it was too dangerous for human entry, but 5 college students spent an entire night digging in, only to discover why it had been sealed in the first place. The second cave sits alone in the Arizona desert, and on one night in 1986, it witnessed either a tragic accident or something far more disturbing, and nobody knows which. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the night of November 1st, 1986, 5 college students decided to dig their way into a sealed cave near their campus. The caves near Northfield, Minnesota, aren't massive tourist attractions or well-known geological wonders. They're a part of the limestone cave systems that are scattered throughout the upper Midwest. Most of these caves are small, tight passages that attract local spelunkers and curious college students looking for underground adventure. St. Olaf College sits right in Northfield, and like many college towns, it has its share of local legends and mysterious places that students whisper about. The caves in the area had become something of a local attraction for adventurous students over the years, the kind of place where you might go with friends to explore, have a few drinks, or just do something that felt rebellious and exciting. But here's the thing about the particular cave system that would become the focus of our story. It had been deliberately sealed 8 years earlier. This wasn't an accident or natural occurrence. Local authorities had made a conscious decision to fill the entrance with dirt and debris to prevent people from entering. When caves get sealed like this, it's usually for very good reasons. Maybe the cave system is unstable, maybe there have been accidents, or maybe the passages are too dangerous for inexperienced explorers. On this particular Saturday night in November, 5 students from St. Olaf College made the decision to ignore the fact that the cave had been sealed. These weren't seasoned cave explorers with proper equipment and training. They were college kids looking for adventure, who probably had no idea why the cave entrance had been filled in the first place. The group included Thomas E. Johnson, a 20-year-old student who was presumably looking forward to what seemed like a fun, late-night exploration with his friends. The 5 students arrived at the sealed cave entrance sometime that evening, probably armed with nothing more than flashlights and the kind of confidence that comes with being young and thinking you're invincible. When they examined the sealed entrance, they found it completely blocked with dirt, rocks, and debris that had been deliberately placed there to prevent exactly what they were planning to do. A smart group would have looked at this obvious barrier and realized that maybe this wasn't a place they should be trying to enter. But these 5 students decided to dig. Using nothing but their bare hands and a single pail to remove the dirt and debris, they began the backbreaking work of tunneling through the sealed entrance. As they made some progress, they felt that the cave was stable, with maybe water flowing through the cracks, solidifying all the dirt and debris. This wasn't easy work. They were essentially creating a horizontal tunnel through packed earth and rocks, working in cramped conditions with limited lighting and no proper tools. Think about what they were doing for a moment. They were digging a tunnel through unstable fill material that had been deliberately placed to block access to the cave. The dirt and debris wasn't naturally occurring sediment that had been deposited over time. It was loose fill that had been dumped into the entrance. This kind of material is inherently unstable, especially when you start removing it and creating voids underneath. The students worked for hours, taking turns crawling into their makeshift tunnel and scooping out handfuls of dirt with their bare hands. As the night wore on, they managed to tunnel about 15 feet, 4.5 meters, through the sealed entrance. 15 feet might not sound like much, but when you're digging a tunnel just wide enough for a person to crawl through, that represents hours of exhausting work. They were getting close to breaking through to the actual cave system beyond the fill. The progress was slow and dangerous, but the students were probably getting excited as they got deeper into their tunnel. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't have known without proper training or experience, was that every handful of dirt they removed was making their tunnel more unstable. The loose fill material above them was being held up by nothing more than the material they were digging out below, and eventually, basic physics was going to take over. At around midnight, after hours of digging, the inevitable happened. the fill material above their tunnel collapsed. The collapse was sudden and catastrophic. One moment, Thomas Johnson was inside the tunnel working to remove more dirt. And the next moment, tons of earth and debris came crashing down on top of him. The weight was enormous. We're talking about the equivalent of several dump truck loads of dirt, rocks, and debris falling on a single person. The three other students who were just inside the tunnel entrance were lucky enough to be far enough back that they weren't completely buried, but they were still caught in the collapse zone. They found themselves trapped in a partially collapsed tunnel with their friend Thomas, somewhere under tons of earth ahead of them. The fifth student, who had been outside the entrance when the collapse occurred, was the only one who remained completely free and able to help. But he was also the only witness to what had just happened, watching his friends disappear under a mountain of falling earth in a matter of seconds. The panic that set in was immediate and overwhelming. The students who were partially trapped in the tunnel were screaming for Thomas, trying to dig toward where they thought he might be buried, but they were working with their bare hands against tons of unstable material. Every movement they made could potentially trigger another collapse that would bury them as well. The student who was outside immediately understood that this was far beyond anything they could handle themselves. He ran to get help, probably running faster than he'd ever run in his life, knowing that his friend was buried alive somewhere under all that dirt and that every second counted. When emergency services received the call about a cave-in with people trapped, they immediately dispatched rescue teams to the scene. But even as the rescuers were racing to the location, everyone involved probably knew that the situation was desperate. Being buried under tons of dirt and debris doesn't leave much margin for survival. Professional rescue workers arrived at the scene with proper equipment and began the dangerous work of trying to locate Thomas Johnson and dig him out of the collapsed tunnel. But they had to work carefully. One wrong move could trigger another collapse that would bury the rescuers as well. The other three students who had been partially trapped in the tunnel were extracted relatively quickly, but they were in shock and couldn't provide much useful information about exactly where Thomas had been when the collapse occurred. The rescue workers had to essentially guess at his location and begin the painstaking process of removing dirt and debris. Working in the dark, in cramped conditions, with unstable material all around them, the rescue team began digging. They knew they were racing against time. If Thomas was still alive under all that earth, he had a very limited air supply and was probably suffering from compression injuries from the weight pressing down on him. The psychological pressure on everyone involved was enormous. Thomas's friends were watching helplessly as rescuers tried to find their buried friend, knowing that they were the ones who had talked him into this ill-advised adventure. The rescue workers were putting their own lives at risk, trying to save someone who might already be dead. At approximately 1:30 a.m., about an hour and a half after the collapse, the rescue workers finally located Thomas Johnson's body. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The weight and pressure of the collapsed material had been too much for him to survive, and he had likely died very quickly after the cave-in occurred. The recovery of Thomas's body was a heartbreaking end to what had started as a group of friends looking for a late-night adventure. The other four students were left to deal with the trauma of watching their friend die in a completely preventable accident, while Thomas's family had to cope with the loss of their 20-year-old son, who had died trying to access a cave that had been deliberately sealed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. The cave had been sealed for good reasons, probably because it was unstable, dangerous, or had been the site of previous accidents. The authorities who made the decision to fill the entrance 8 years earlier had been trying to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy that ultimately claimed Thomas's life. Days later, the cave was sealed again, this time forever. Dante's descent sits in the high desert country near Ash Fork, Arizona, about 50 miles west of Flagstaff. This isn't some well-known tourist attraction or marked scenic overlook. It's a remote, dangerous natural pit that drops straight down 300 feet, 91 meters, into the earth. The formation gets its ominous name from Dante's Inferno, and when you see this gaping hole in the desert floor, you understand why someone would connect it to the gates of hell. On September 23, 1986, 33-year-old Eugene Campbell had apparently been drawn to this remote desert pit. Campbell wasn't a professional or geologist. He was just a regular guy from the Kingman area who, for whatever reason, had become fascinated with Dante's descent. But here's where the story starts to get complicated and where the truth becomes much harder to pin down. A few days before September 23rd, two experienced cave explorers had encountered Campbell at Dante's descent under circumstances that were deeply concerning. They found him sitting alone at the edge of the pit, with his legs hanging over the side, drinking beer, and appearing what they described as very despondent. The two spelunkers who encountered Campbell were experienced enough to recognize that this was a potentially dangerous situation. They approached him and presumably tried to assess his state of mind, but Campbell eventually left the area. However, the spelunkers were sufficiently concerned about what they had witnessed. After Campbell left that day, his friends apparently became worried about him. According to reports, they were specifically concerned that he might be contemplating something. The fact that his friends were worried enough to come looking for him and that they were specifically concerned about something indicates that Campbell's visit to Dante's descent wasn't just a casual sightseeing trip. He had apparently been exhibiting behavior or expressing thoughts that made the people who cared about him worried. On the night of September 23rd, shortly after midnight, Eugene Campbell made the decision to return to Dante's descent. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had convinced a friend to come with him, possibly telling him they were just going to look at the formation, or maybe explore the upper edges of the pit. What happened next would haunt his friend for the rest of his life. The two men arrived at the remote desert location in the darkness, armed with flashlights and whatever gear they thought they might need. Dante's descent is an intimidating sight even during the day, but at night, with only artificial light to illuminate the massive void, it becomes something truly terrifying. The beam of a flashlight can't penetrate 300 feet, 91 meters of darkness. When you shine a light into Dante's descent at night, it just disappears into a black abyss. Campbell and his friend approached the edge of the pit, probably discussing their plans for exploring or examining the formation. Maybe Campbell was showing his friend the same spot where he had been sitting with his legs over the edge just days earlier. Maybe they were trying to get a better view of the pit's dimensions, or looking for a way to safely examine the upper portions of the cave system. But something went horribly wrong. According to the witness account, Campbell suddenly fell into the pit. One moment he was standing at the edge with his friend, and the next moment he was gone, plummeting 300 feet down into the darkness of Dante's descent. His friend watched in absolute horror as Campbell disappeared into the black void below. The sound of someone falling 300 feet would have been terrifying. First the silence as Campbell fell through the air, then the sickening impact as he hit the bottom of the pit. In the desert silence, those sounds would have echoed off the rock walls and carried for miles. Campbell's friend was suddenly alone at the edge of a massive pit, knowing that his companion had just fallen to almost certain death, but unable to do anything to help him. There was no way to climb down into Dante's descent, no way to reach Campbell, and probably no way to even see his body in the darkness at the bottom of the 300-foot drop. The psychological trauma of witnessing something like that would have been overwhelming. Campbell's friend had just watched someone he cared about fall to their death, and he was completely helpless to prevent it or provide any assistance. The guilt, shock, and horror of that moment would have been devastating. The friend somehow managed to get help, probably driving in a state of shock to find emergency services or other people who could assist with what was now clearly a recovery operation rather than a rescue. When emergency responders arrived at Dante's descent, they confirmed what Campbell's friend already knew. There was no way anyone could survive a 300-foot fall onto the rock floor of the pit. The recovery of Campbell's body was an extremely dangerous and complex operation. Professional rescue teams rappelled down 300 feet, about 90 meters, into the pit using specialized equipment. The teams involved in this operation were risking their own lives to bring Campbell back to his family. The terrain at Dante's descent made things especially difficult. The vertical walls of the shaft required ropes anchored into solid rock, and responders had to descend one by one, carefully managing their lines to avoid rockfall. At the bottom, working in darkness with only helmet lamps, they secured Campbell's body into a stretcher system designed for vertical hauling. Communication was maintained through radios, but even so, the sheer depth created delays and risks. Once everything was prepared, a coordinated pulley system was used to lift the stretcher inch by inch. But here's where the story gets complicated again, because even having a witness doesn't answer all the questions about what really happened that night. Did Campbell slip accidentally while trying to get a better look at the pit? Was he under the influence of alcohol, as suggested by his earlier drinking at the same location? Did his previous despondent behavior and his friends' concerns about him ending his life mean that this wasn't an accident at all? Campbell's friend would have been the only person who could answer these questions, but the trauma of witnessing such a horrific event might have affected his ability to provide clear details about exactly what happened in those crucial moments before Campbell fell. The fact that Campbell had been seen in a despondent state just days earlier, combined with his friend's specific concerns, raises the possibility that what looked like an accident to his friend might have actually been intentional. Someone who was planning to take their own life might not reveal their true intentions to the person they bring with them as a witness. Alternatively, Campbell might have been genuinely trying to show his friend something about the pit or get a better view of the cave system when he slipped and fell accidentally. The rocky, uneven ground around Dante's descent would be treacherous in the darkness, and one wrong step could easily send someone over the edge. Eugene Campbell's death at Dante's descent remains a tragedy regardless of whether it was accidental or intentional. A 33-year-old man lost his life in one of the most horrible ways imaginable, falling 300 feet into a dark pit in the middle of the Arizona desert. His friend was left with memories that would probably haunt him forever, and his family was left to grieve without fully understanding what had driven him to that remote, dangerous location in the middle of the night.